For those of you who follow politics, you can realize what a night it was for Mitt Romney. A big win for him in the big state of Illinois. And he increases his lead in the fight for the Republican nomination.
But Rick Santorum says he's not giving up. John Jessup has this look at the results from the land of Lincoln and what lies ahead.
Shortly after the last polls closed, Mitt Romney emerged as the victor in Illinois.
Thank you, Illinois. What a night. Wow.
It was just the win he needed after narrow victories in Michigan and Ohio, and a campaign map that showed his primary challenger, Rick Santorum, with a stronghold in the Midwest and South.
We know our future is brighter than these troubled times. We still believe in America. And we deserve a president who believes in us, and I believe in the American people.
The former Massachusetts governor refused to risk losing in the land of Lincoln, outspending Santorum 7-1. Adding salt to the wound, Santorum was only eligible to win 44 of the state's 54 delegates because of filing problems. With freedom as his backdrop, the former Pennsylvania senator vowed to keep on fighting, looking ahead to Louisiana's primary this weekend and beyond.
We got 5 weeks to a big win and a big delegate sweep in Pennsylvania.
The good news for Santorum, he's starting to make inroads with Republican women. A new poll shows him surging ahead of Mitt Romney in that constituency. That gives him more incentive to stay in the race, not to mention the other candidates.
As long as they believe that they can have a chance for a brokered convention, they're going to keep in the race, hoping that it'll be a deadlock and that their turn will come at the convention.
Romney continues to focus his attention on the man he hopes to unseat in November. He referenced President Obama's recent speech on energy, in which he described America as a nation of inventors and builders.
We are Thomas Edison, we are the Wright brothers, we are Bill Gates, we are Steve Jobs, that's who we are.
Blaming the administration for holding back economic growth, Romney pounced.
That's true. But the problem is, he's still Barack Obama.
Romney now has an even more sizable lead over Santorum by more than 2-1, though he's still shy of the halfway mark in the race for delegates. John Jessup, CBN News, Washington.
There was a Spanish writer named Cervantes who came up with an interesting character named Don Quixote, who decided he was going to go and tilt at the enemies of himself and the state, and he found windmills running around, and he thought the windmills were the enemies, and so he charged on his famous horse, tilting at windmills. And we use the term quixotic to describe somebody that tilts at windmills in a race that he can't win. And I got a feeling that a couple of those guys in the Republican field are right out of Cervantes, and you wonder when they're going to break their picks and stop chasing windmills. Lee Webb has the rest of our top stories in the CBN Newsroom. Lee?
Pat, House Republicans are calling for deep spending cuts and a dramatic overhaul of the tax code. Their proposals are outlined in the new budget unveiled Tuesday. Republicans want Americans to see a sharp contrast with President Obama's budget proposals. Mark Martin has the story.
House Republicans, led by the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Representative Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, say they want Americans to have an alternative when it comes to the nation's budget.
We feel morally bound to offer a choice, and we have a legal obligation in our budget laws to produce a budget. The president's budget is putting us on a path of a debt crisis, of decline.
To avoid a financial crisis, House Republicans say it's necessary to be bold in spending cuts.
All in all, what we're proposing here is to cut $5.3 trillion in spending from the president's budget.
The Republican plan also transfers Medicaid to states to save money and balances the budget by 2040. It would gradually raise the Medicare retirement age from 65 to 67. In addition, House Republicans suggest cutting tax rates. The plan would mean only 2 tax rates for Americans, 10% and 25%. The plan would also cut the business tax rate to 25%. The Republicans also want to do away with the alternative minimum tax that was originally created as a tax on the wealthy, but now it's hitting a growing number of middle-class Americans. The plan stands in sharp contrast to the budget released by President Obama last month, which relies on tax increases on the wealthy and mostly leaves benefit programs alone.
This plan of action is about putting an end to empty promises from bankrupt government and restoring the fundamental promise of America, ensuring that our children have more opportunity than we do.
The White House and Democrats call the GOP plan unfair and criticize it for going after entitlements like Medicare. House Republicans admit their plan has no chance of becoming law, but they wanted to distance themselves from the president and the Senate.
This is what the Senate gets you by doing nothing, by not passing a budget for 3 years in a row. This is a future that gives our children a diminished country. This is the future that ruins our economy.
Mark Martin, CBN News.
Pat, we're going to talk about the President Obama's tax increase on the wealthy, but what do you think about Paul Ryan's plan?
I think it's brilliant. I really do. I think Ryan is very courageous. He's intelligent. He understands numbers. He understands budget problems. And he's laid down a marker. So the House will pass that budget. They'll send it on to the Senate. And then the Senate will have to say, no, we don't want to stop wasteful spending. We don't want to curb the growth of government. And we say all these cuts are unfair. It doesn't matter whether it's feather bedding or whether it's waste or, fraud. It doesn't matter. We don't want to cut any of that out. It's amazing how they just line up against any cuts whatsoever. And this will be the document that the Republicans will be campaigning on this fall. And the Democrats are going to refuse to pass a budget in the Senate. They'll do it at their own peril. Well, how do they solve the problem? They stick it to the millionaires. And if we tax the millionaires, all will be well. Or will it, Lee?
Well, let's talk about that, Pat. President Obama's so-called Buffett rule to raise taxes on upper-income Americans would not bring in much money. That's according to a new study by the official tax analyst for Congress, the Joint Committee on Taxation. The Buffett rule, as it's called, would require people making $1 million a year or more to pay at least 30% in taxes. But the committee found that it would only bring in $31 billion over 11 years. That's less than $3 billion a year. The $31 billion is just a drop in the bucket compared to the $7 trillion in deficits expected during those years. Workers at government hospitals in Greece went on strike today. They're protesting government spending cuts. Those cuts were made so Greece can keep getting loans to avoid default. The country's parliament approved the latest international bailout plan on Tuesday. The package, plus the one Greece already received, is more than $225 billion. Pat?
Well, that's the way it's going to be here in America. Once we begin serious cuts in entitlements, serious cuts in the pay of federal workers, serious cuts in all the things that need to get cut, then people will begin to protest. And like in Greece, they say, we're not going to stand for it. They don't have the big picture. They don't put the interests of their country ahead of their own personal selfish interests. And as a result, Greece was down the tubes. But we'll see what happens here in America. Are we going to be like Greece? We're heading in that direction. Sad story about football's hero, Lee.
That's right, Pat. Tim Tebow is handling, though, the loss of his starting quarterback position with the Denver Broncos with class. Broncos executive John Elway says Tebow was disappointed but understanding when told of Denver's plans to sign Peyton Manning. Elway was not surprised by Tebow's reaction, though, and he said he's the kind of guy he hopes his daughter would marry someday. Tebow's future is getting as much coverage as Manning's signing. Several teams are said to be in discussions with the Broncos about a trade for the former Heisman Trophy winner from Florida, including Tim Tebow's hometown team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Central Mexico is beginning to clean up now after a 7.4 earthquake. It struck between two popular spring break destinations down there, and among the thousands of American tourists in the quake zone is President Obama's daughter, Malia. Charlene Israel has that story.
It hit around noon local time. One woman described it as a drop and then uncontrollable shaking. People evacuated into the streets and then stayed there, afraid to go back in as aftershocks began.
We were on the 20th floor and everything started shaking and the windows were shaking and I sat on the floor and it was very scary. I've never felt nothing like that before.
The powerful quake could be felt up to 100 miles away. Experts say the epicenter was in Guerrero State, affecting thousands of American students on spring break in the region, including the president's daughter, Malia. The White House released a statement saying she's safe. No deaths are being reported, but officials say hundreds of homes are destroyed and several bridges collapsed, one crushing this truck. Experts say this quake struck at a shallow depth, making the shaking more intense. Mexico straddles one of the most active thrust fault lines in the Western Hemisphere. The last major quake struck in 1985, killing about 10,000 people. Charlene Israel, CBN News.
Yeah, and since 1973, there have been 15 strong earthquakes in that same region as Tuesday's quake. Experts, Pat, believe that many of the weaker buildings collapsed in one of the previous quakes.
Well, it's a dangerous area, and they haven't reinforced the buildings as they should, but I'm sure they're trying their best to build them back up again. But thank goodness there was no great loss of life.
French police now have pinned down the suspect in the deadly attack on a Jewish school. The 24-year-old gunman had been holed up in a building that's surrounded by police. He claims to have ties to al-Qaeda and is suspected of killing 3 Jewish school children, a rabbi, and 3 French paratroopers in separate attacks. He said he, quote, wants to take revenge for Palestinian children killed in the Middle East. Authorities say he spent time in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Women seeking abortions in Utah will soon have to wait 72 hours before undergoing the procedure. Republican Governor Gary Herbert signed that bill into law, and it takes effect in May. The measure gives Utah the longest abortion waiting period now in the U.S. Women seeking abortions will have a face-to-face consultation that tells them about their baby and alternatives to abortion. Then the 72-hour waiting period begins. You can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.